The blood-stained letter trembled in Vivian Reed's hands as she stood motionless on the dusty main street of Promise Creek, Arizona Territory, 1878. The townspeople's whispers felt like bullets piercing her already wounded heart, their judgment forming an invisible barrier around her as surely as the mountains that encircled their frontier town. "She ain't right in the head no more," Matilda Johnson's voice carried from the general store porch, not even attempting to lower her volume. "Not since what happened at Callaway Ridge." "That poor thing," Agnes Porter replied with mock sympathy. "She's too broken to ever be whole again." Vivian folded the letter with deliberate precision, tucking it into her worn leather satchel before straightening her simple gray dress, the one she'd worn every day since returning to Promise Creek 3 months ago. The townsfolk had taken to calling her the Ghost Widow, though she'd never actually married James before his brutal murder. His death, along with the rest of the mining camp at Callaway Ridge, had left her the sole survivor of a massacre that had claimed 23 lives. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention, and she turned to see Xavier Irwin riding into town, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the setting sun. Everyone knew Xavier, the cattle baron's son, who'd chosen the life of a ranch hand rather than accepting his father's empire. His reputation as a skilled horseman was matched only by rumors of his fierce loyalty and stubborn independence. "Miss Reed," he nodded, tipping his worn Stetson as he dismounted his chestnut stallion outside the sheriff's office. His eyes met hers, briefly, deep hazel eyes that seemed to look straight through the carefully constructed walls she'd built around herself. Vivian nodded curtly before continuing toward her destination, the small cabin on the outskirts of town she'd inherited from her father. She could feel Xavier's eyes following her, but she refused to look back. She had no room in her life for pity, especially not from a man like him. Inside the sheriff's office, Xavier removed his hat and dust-covered duster. Sheriff Thompson looked up from his desk, eyebrows raised in question. "Got word of rustlers moving north from the Sonora border," Xavier explained. "Thought you should know they might be headed this way." The sheriff nodded gravely. "Appreciate the warning. You staying in town tonight?" "Figure I might," Xavier replied, his mind drifting to the haunted eyes of Vivian Reed. "Heard any more about that woman? The one from Callaway Ridge?" The sheriff's expression darkened. "Vivian? Poor thing's still not talking much about what happened. Comes into town for supplies once a week, keeps to herself otherwise." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Between you and me, I'm worried about her. Living alone out there, after everything she's seen." "What exactly did happen at Callaway?" Xavier asked, realizing he only knew fragments of the story. "Apache raid is what most folks say," the sheriff replied, though his tone suggested uncertainty. "But something doesn't add up. 23 dead, and she's the only one walked away. Found her wandering the desert half dead 3 days later. Doc said she'd been shot and left for dead, but somehow survived." He shook his head. "She's never given a full account of what happened, and folks are starting to talk." Xavier frowned. "What kind of talk?" "Some say she might have had something to do with it. Others think she's lost her mind. Most just whisper that she's broken beyond repair." Something in the sheriff's words stirred a deep anger in Xavier. "People should mind their own business." "That's not the way of small towns, son," the sheriff replied with a knowing look, "especially when there's mystery involved." Later that evening, Xavier sat at a corner table in the Promise Creek saloon, nursing a whiskey as he observed the locals. The usual Saturday night crowd had gathered ranchers, miners, and townspeople seeking respite from the harsh realities of frontier life. "Heard you were asking about the Reed woman," a voice interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to find Elijah Parker, the town's banker, standing beside his table with an expression of practiced concern. "Just curious," Xavier replied noncommittally. Parker sat down uninvited, leaning forward. "My advice, stay clear of that one. Something ain't right with her. The way she survived when everyone else died, and now she hardly speaks, jumps at shadows. He tapped his temple meaningfully. Damaged goods, if you ask me. Xavier's jaw tightened. Didn't ask you. The banker seemed taken aback by Xavier's curtness but pressed on. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. She's too broken to. A woman survives something terrible and that makes her broken? Xavier cut him off, his voice low but sharp. Seems to me that makes her the strongest woman I know. The silence that followed his statement spread through the nearby tables, and Xavier realized he'd spoken louder than intended. He stood abruptly, tossed coins on the table, and walked out into the cool night air, unsure why he'd defended a woman he barely knew. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of Arizona day that promised scorching heat by noon. Vivian woke with the sun, as always, her nightmares having given her little rest. The small cabin felt both like a sanctuary and a prison, the only place she felt safe, yet a constant reminder of all she had lost. She went about her morning chores, mechanically feeding the few chickens she kept, tending her small garden, and checking the water barrel. These simple tasks had become her anchor to reality in the months since Callaway Ridge. When she worked, she didn't have to think about blood-soaked memories or face the crushing weight of survivor's guilt. The sound of an approaching horse broke her routine. Vivian stiffened, her hand instinctively reaching for the rifle she kept propped against the cabin wall. Few people ventured out this far, and none were welcome. She stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, to see Xavier Irwin approaching on horseback. He slowed his mount to a walk when he spotted her, raising his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. "Morning, Miss Reed," he called, stopping a respectful distance from her property line. "Sorry to intrude." "What do you want, Mr. Irwin?" she asked, not lowering her rifle. "Brought you something," he replied, gesturing to a burlap sack tied to his saddle. "Some vegetables from the ranch garden. More than we can use." Vivian's suspicion didn't waver. "Why?" Xavier seemed taken aback by the directness of her question. "No particular reason, just being neighborly." "I don't need charity," she replied flatly. "Not offering any," he countered. "Just thought you might appreciate some fresh produce. Take it or leave it." Something in his straightforward manner caught her off guard. There was no pity in his eyes, no uncomfortable shifting of weight or nervous glances that she'd grown accustomed to from others. He simply waited for her decision, as if her answer held no more significance than a comment about the weather. After a long moment, Vivian lowered her rifle slightly. "You can leave it by the fence." Xavier nodded, dismounting to untie the sack. As he placed it by her gate, he spoke without looking at her. "There's talk of rustlers in the area. Might be nothing, but thought you should know. Keep that rifle handy." The warning was delivered matter-of-factly, like one rancher to another, not a man protecting a fragile woman. The unexpected respect in his tone stirred something inside Vivian, the first emotion besides fear or anger she'd felt in months. "I can take care of myself, Mr. Irwin." He glanced up then, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "Never doubted that for a second, Miss Reed." With a tip of his hat, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Vivian staring after him with a mixture of confusion and something else she couldn't quite name. 3 days later, Xavier returned to Promise Creek for supplies. As he loaded sacks of flour and coffee into his saddlebags outside the general store, he overheard Matilda Johnson and Agnes Porter gossiping on the porch. "Did you hear? Vivian Reed shot at Thomas Wilson yesterday when he was hunting near her property," Matilda said, her voice carrying easily on the still afternoon air. "No," Agnes gasped dramatically. "Did she hit him?" "Just missed him, he says. Claims he was just tracking a deer that wandered onto her land, and she came out screaming about trespassers and fired a warning shot." "That woman is dangerous," Agnes declared. "Sheriff ought to do something before she actually hurts someone." Xavier finished his task deliberately slowly, listening as the women continued their speculation about Vivian's mental state. Their casual cruelty made his blood simmer. Without consciously deciding to, he approached their conversation. "Afternoon, ladies," he said, tipping his hat. "Couldn't help overhearing your concern about Miss Reed." Both women straightened, suddenly aware they had an audience. Matilda forced a smile. Mr. Irwin. Yes, it's just terrible about poor Vivian. We're all so worried about her state of mind. Is that right? Xavier replied coolly. Because it sounded more like you were enjoying having something to talk about. Agnes bristled. Now see here. No, you see here, Xavier interrupted, keeping his voice level but firm. That poor woman survived something none of us can imagine, and instead of helping her, this town treats her like she's either crazy or criminal. Well, normal people don't shoot at neighbors, Matilda huffed. Thomas Wilson hasn't been hunting a day in his life, Xavier countered. Everyone knows he's been trying to pressure folks on the outskirts to sell their land cheap to that mining company. He leaned closer to the now silent women. Next time you feel the need to gossip about Vivian Reed, ask yourselves what you'd do in her shoes. Might make for less entertaining conversation, but at least you'd be honest. He turned and walked away, mounting his horse without looking back. He hadn't planned to visit Vivian again, but he found himself turning his horse toward her cabin instead of the ranch. When he arrived, he was surprised to find Vivian outside, digging in her garden with focused determination. She looked up at his approach, wariness instantly replacing the brief flash of vulnerability he'd glimpsed on her face. Mr. Irwin, back again. She stood, wiping soil from her hands onto her apron. Don't tell me you have more vegetables to spare. Actually, I was wondering if I could trouble you for some water for my horse, he replied. Been riding since dawn. Vivian studied him for a moment before nodding toward the water trough near the small barn. Help yourself. As Xavier led his horse to drink, he noticed the changes she'd made to the property since his last visit. The garden had been expanded, and the cabin's broken window had been repaired with new glass. Small improvements that spoke of a woman planning to stay, to rebuild. You've been busy, he observed. Vivian returned to her digging. Keeps my hands occupied. And your mind? The question slipped out before he could stop it. Her movement stilled, and for a moment, Xavier thought she might order him off her property. Instead, she sat back on her heels, staring at the turned earth. Nothing keeps my mind occupied enough, she admitted quietly, but the work helps. The honesty of her response stirred something in Xavier. He led his horse back toward where she worked. I heard about Thomas Wilson. Vivian's expression hardened. Come to warn me about shooting at innocent hunters? No, Xavier replied. Came to tell you that Wilson works for the Territorial Mining Company. They've been trying to buy up land all around here. Thought you should know. Surprise flickered across her face. Why tell me this? Xavier shrugged. Seems like something a neighbor should know. We're not neighbors, she pointed out. Your ranch is miles from here. Close enough in these parts, he countered with a slight smile. Vivian studied him with those penetrating gray eyes that seemed to carry the weight of 100 years' sorrow. Why are you really here, Mr. Irwin? Most people in town cross the street when they see me coming. I'm not most people, Xavier replied simply, and I don't much care for how this town treats you. I don't need your pity, she said, her voice taking on an edge. Good, because I'm not offering any. He met her gaze steadily. What happened at Callaway Ridge wasn't your fault, no matter what folks whisper. Living through something like that doesn't make you broken, Miss Reed. It makes you a survivor. Something shifted in Vivian's expression, a tiny crack in the carefully maintained wall she'd built around herself. For just a moment, Xavier glimpsed the woman behind the trauma-intelligent, resolute, and achingly alone. You don't know anything about me, she said, but the words lacked conviction. I'd like to, Xavier replied honestly, if you'd ever care to tell me. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken pain and cautious possibility. Finally, Vivian stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. It's getting late, Mr. Irwin. You should head back before dark. Xavier recognized the dismissal but didn't take offense. Of course. He mounted his horse, then hesitated. I ride this way most Tuesdays. Would it bother you if I stopped by next week? Vivian seemed genuinely perplexed by his persistence. Why would you want to? Maybe I just enjoy your company, he replied with a small smile. I'm hardly good company these days, she said, a trace of bitter humor in her voice. I'll be the judge of that. Xavier tipped his hat. Until Tuesday, then, Miss Reed. As he rode away, he resisted the urge to look back, though he could feel her gaze following him. There was something about Vivian Reed that drew him like a moth to flame, not just her beauty, which persisted despite the shadows under her eyes and the new hardness to her features, but the fierce determination that radiated from her even in silence. The gossips called her broken, but Xavier recognized her strength. He'd seen enough of the world to know the difference. The following Tuesday arrived with unseasonable rain, turning the desert landscape into a tapestry of rushing water and mud. Xavier considered postponing his visit, but found himself riding toward Vivian's cabin nonetheless, a tarp-covered crate tied securely behind his saddle. By the time he arrived, the rain had lightened to a steady drizzle. Vivian's cabin looked deserted at first glance, but a thin line of smoke from the chimney suggested otherwise. He approached cautiously, calling out from a distance to announce his presence. The door opened slightly, and Vivian peered out, surprise evident on her face. "Mr. Irwin, what are you doing out in this weather?" "Said I'd come Tuesday," he replied, water streaming from the brim of his hat. "It's Tuesday." A complicated expression crossed her face, something between exasperation and reluctant amusement. "You're soaking wet." "Noticed that myself," he agreed with a ghost of a smile. "Mind if I step in for a few minutes? Brought something that shouldn't get any wetter." Vivian hesitated only briefly before opening the door wider. "Leave your boots and coat by the door." The interior of the cabin was simple but meticulously maintained. A fire crackled in the small stone hearth, and the scent of fresh bread filled the warm space. Xavier carefully removed his drenched outer garments before bringing in the crate he'd carried. "What is that?" Vivian asked, eyeing the mysterious package. Xavier set it down on the small table in the center of the room and pulled back the tarp. "Books from my father's library. Thought you might like something to read during the long evenings." Vivian approached cautiously, as if the crate might contain snakes rather than literature. Her fingers hovered over the spines of several novels, histories, and scientific texts, the eclectic collection Xavier had selected from his family's extensive library. "Why would you do this?" she asked, bewilderment evident in her voice. Xavier shrugged, suddenly self-conscious about the gesture. "Seemed like something you might enjoy. You can borrow them as long as you like, or not at all if they don't interest you." Vivian lifted one volume, a collection of poetry by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and opened it carefully. "I haven't read anything but the newspaper in months." "Then you're well overdue," Xavier replied, pleased by the spark of interest in her eyes. It was the first time he'd seen any emotion from her that wasn't related to pain or suspicion. Vivian closed the book and set it aside, her practical nature reasserting itself. "You're still dripping on my floor, Mr. Irwin. Sit by the fire before you catch your death. I've got coffee on the stove." Xavier accepted the invitation, settling into a worn wooden chair near the hearth, while Vivian poured 2 cups of strong black coffee. When she handed him his cup, their fingers brushed briefly, and he noted how she quickly withdrew her hand, as if unaccustomed to human contact. "May I ask you something, Miss Reed?" Xavier ventured after they'd sat in surprisingly comfortable silence for several minutes. Wariness returned to her expression. "Depends what you're asking." "What did you do before?" He hesitated, not wanting to directly mention the tragedy. "Before you came back to Promise Creek?" The question seemed to surprise her, perhaps, because it wasn't about the massacre that everyone else could speak of nothing else. "I was a teacher," she replied after a moment, "in a mining camp school. Before that, I taught in Santa Fe for 2 years after finishing my education in Denver." Xavier nodded, adding this piece to the puzzle of who Vivian Reed was beneath the trauma. "You miss it? Teaching?" A shadow passed over her face. "I miss who I was when I taught. That woman. She's gone now." "I don't believe that," Xavier said quietly. Vivian's eyes snapped to his, a flash of anger replacing the melancholy. "You don't know what I've seen, what I've endured." "No," he agreed. I don't. But I know something about loss, Miss Reed. And about rebuilding after you think everything worth having is gone. Something in his tone must have conveyed his sincerity, because the anger in her eyes softened slightly. What did you lose, Mr. Irwin? It was Xavier's turn to stare into the fire, memories he rarely visited rising to the surface. My wife and son, 7 years ago. Cholera took them both in less than a week. Vivian's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the cabin for several heartbeats. I'm sorry, she finally said, and Xavier could hear that she truly meant it. Thought I'd die too for a while there, he continued, his voice low. Wanted to some days. Spent 2 years trying to drink myself into an early grave. What changed? Vivian asked quietly. Xavier looked up, meeting her gaze directly. Nothing dramatic. Just woke up one morning and realized Sarah would have been furious with me for wasting the life she didn't get to have. Started putting one foot in front of the other. Some days were just about surviving. But eventually, I found reasons to live again, not just exist. Vivian's expression remained guarded, but something had shifted in her posture, a slight relaxing of the constant tension she carried. I'm not sure I'll find those reasons. You will, Xavier said with quiet conviction. You already are. That garden outside, the repaired window, the fresh bread I can smell. These are not the actions of someone who's given up. Vivian looked away, uncomfortable with his observations. The rain's letting up, she noted, changing the subject. You should head back before the washes flood. Xavier recognized the dismissal and didn't push further. He stood, gathering his now slightly drier coat. Keep the books as long as you like. I can bring more when you're done. At the door, he paused, turning back to find Vivian standing with her arms wrapped protectively around herself, the poetry volume clutched in one hand. For what it's worth, Miss Reed, I think the teacher is still there, just waiting until it's safe to come out again. Before she could respond, he slipped outside into the dwindling rain, leaving Vivian staring after him with an expression caught between longing and fear. The following weeks established a pattern. Every Tuesday, Xavier would ride to Vivian's cabin, sometimes bringing small gift seeds for her garden, a new type of tea from the general store, more books as she finished the previous ones. Their conversations gradually lengthened, though Vivian maintained careful boundaries. She never invited him to stay for a meal, and she never spoke of Calloway Ridge. Yet something was changing between them, an almost imperceptible shift toward trust. Xavier noticed how Vivian no longer reached for her rifle when he approached, how she sometimes waited on the porch for his arrival. She began to ask questions about his ranch, his daily life, even his past, though she rarely volunteered information about her own. In town, Xavier became known as Vivian Reed's unlikely defender. When he overheard whispers about her, he confronted them directly, challenging the rumors and gossip with calm but unyielding firmness. Some attributed his interest to pity, others to romantic intentions, but Xavier paid them no mind. He couldn't have explained his compulsion to protect Vivian, even to himself. He only knew that the strength he recognized in her deserved respect, not the town's fear and judgment. One Tuesday in late October, Xavier arrived to find Vivian more agitated than usual. She paced the small confines of her cabin, hands twisting nervously as she recounted a visit from Thomas Wilson and another man claiming to represent the Territorial Mining Company. They offered to buy my land, she explained, anger evident in her clipped words. Said it would be easier for everyone if I sold now and moved somewhere I could start fresh. Xavier frowned. The company's been getting more aggressive. They've been buying up claims all through these foothills. I told them I wasn't interested, Vivian continued. The man, Parker was his name, said I should reconsider before things got complicated. She stopped pacing to look directly at Xavier. It sounded like a threat. Elijah Parker, Xavier confirmed grimly. The banker. He's been working with the mining company for months now, though he tries to keep it quiet. He moved closer to Vivian, concern etching his features. Did they threaten you directly? No, nothing I could take to the sheriff. Just implications. She ran a hand through her auburn hair, loosening several strands from her practical bun. This was my father's land. It's all I have left of my family. I won't be bullied into selling. You shouldn't have to be, Xavier agreed. But Parker and his mining friends play rough. Maybe I should stay here tonight. Keep watch. Vivian's head snapped up, alarm replacing anger in her expression. That's not necessary. Vivian, he said softly, using her first name for the first time. I'm worried about your safety. I've been alone here for months, she countered. I can handle myself. Xavier recognized the pride and independence in her stance. I know you can, but there's no shame in accepting help when the odds aren't in your favor. She studied him for a long moment, conflict evident in her expression. The barn has a small loft with a bed. Used to be where my father's ranch hand slept. She turned away quickly. You can stay there, if you insist. Xavier knew better than to push further. Thank you. That evening, they shared their first meal together, a simple stew Vivian had prepared, eaten at her small table by lantern light. The domesticity of the scene struck Xavier powerfully, reminding him of evenings long past with Sarah. Yet Vivian was nothing like his late wife, where Sarah had been gentle and accommodating. Vivian was fierce and self-reliant. The contrast should have emphasized his loss, but instead, Xavier found himself appreciating the unique strength of the woman across from him. Their conversation that night ventured into new territory as Vivian hesitantly asked about his life before Promise Creek. I was born in Boston, he explained. My father made his fortune in shipping, then decided to try his hand at cattle ranching in the West. Brought the whole family out here when I was 15. You didn't want to take over his business? Vivian asked. Xavier smiled ruefully. My father built the biggest ranch in the territory through sheer force of will. He expected his sons to continue his legacy exactly as he envisioned it. He shrugged. My older brother Frederick was happy to follow that path. I wanted something of my own. So you work as a ranch hand instead of living in your father's mansion? Vivian's tone held genuine curiosity rather than judgment. I run my own small spread now, just 500 acres and a modest herd. It's enough. He looked up to find Vivian watching him intently. What about you? How did you end up teaching at Callaway Ridge? The moment the words left his mouth, Xavier regretted them. Vivian's expression shuddered, and she stood abruptly to clear their plates. It's getting late, she said, her back to him. You should get settled in the barn. Xavier rose, mentally berating himself for pushing too far. Vivian, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. It's fine, she cut him off, still not turning around. I can't talk about that. Not yet. The vulnerability in her voice made Xavier want to reach for her, to offer comfort, but he respected the invisible boundary she'd established. I understand. Thank you for the meal. As he turned to leave, Vivian's voice stopped him. Xavier. It was the first time she'd used his given name. Thank you for staying tonight. Any time, he replied simply and meant it. In the barn loft, Xavier lay awake for hours, listening to the night sounds of the desert and keeping watch for any sign of trouble. Around midnight, a noise drew his attention, not the approach of intruders, but a muffled sound from the direction of the cabin. He rose quietly and moved to the barn door, peering toward the small house. Through the window, he could see Vivian pacing, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Even from a distance, he could tell she was crying deep, wrenching sobs that she seemed to be trying to silence. The sight made his chest ache with a fierce protectiveness. Whatever haunted Vivian Reed went deeper than the town gossips could possibly understand, and Xavier found himself wishing he could shoulder some of her burden. He watched until she finally extinguished her lamp, then returned to his makeshift bed, more determined than ever to be the friend she so clearly needed, even if that was all he could ever be. The next morning brought no sign of the mining company representatives, though Xavier insisted on riding into town to speak with Sheriff Thompson about the veiled threats. Vivian reluctantly agreed, though she refused to accompany him. "They'll only listen to you anyway," she said bitterly as he prepared to leave. "The crazy woman from Callaway Ridge hardly makes a credible witness." "You're not crazy, Vivian," Xavier replied firmly, "and anyone who thinks so is a fool." Her smile was sad but genuine. "You're a good man, Xavier Irwin, better than this town deserves." The simple compliment stayed with him as he rode to town, warming him more than the autumn sunshine. In the sheriff's office, Xavier found not only Thompson, but also Elijah Parker and another well-dressed man he didn't recognize. Their conversation halted abruptly when Xavier entered. "Irwin," the sheriff nodded in greeting. "What brings you to town?" "Wanted to talk to you about some concerns at the Reed property," Xavier replied, eyeing Parker with undisguised suspicion. "I can come back later if you're busy." "No need," Parker said smoothly, standing to leave. "Mr. Hamilton and I were just finishing our business." He gestured to his companion. "James Hamilton, head of operations for territorial mining. This is Xavier Irwin, one of our local ranchers." Hamilton extended his hand, which Xavier reluctantly shook. "Pleasure, Mr. Irwin. I understand you're acquainted with Miss Reed." The implication in his tone made Xavier's jaw tighten. "I am. And I understand your men have been pressuring her to sell her property." Hamilton's smile didn't reach his cold eyes, simply making a generous business offer. "Miss Reed's land contains a valuable copper deposit that could bring prosperity to this entire region." "Funny how your generous offers always come with veiled threats," Xavier countered. Parker stepped forward, his expression hardening. "Now see here, Irwin. Nobody's threatened anyone. Miss Reed is clearly not in a state to manage that property alone. We're offering her a chance at a fresh start." "That's not your decision to make," Xavier replied evenly. "And if anything happens to Miss Reed or her property, I'll know exactly where to look first." The tension in the small office was palpable until Sheriff Thompson cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, I suggest we all remember we're civilized folk here. Mr. Parker, Mr. Hamilton, I believe you were leaving." After the mining representatives departed, Xavier explained the situation to the sheriff in detail. Thompson listened with growing concern. "I'll keep an eye out," he promised, "but unless they do something illegal, my hands are tied. The mining company has powerful friends in the territorial government." "Just make sure Parker knows you're watching," Xavier urged. "Might make him think twice before escalating." As Xavier prepared to leave, the sheriff stopped him with a question. "You spending a lot of time out at the Reed place these days?" Xavier met the older man's gaze steadily. "Some. Is that a problem?" Thompson shrugged. "Not for me. But people talk, son. And Vivian Reed is complicated." "People should mind their own business," Xavier replied, an edge to his voice. "Can't argue with that," the sheriff conceded. "Just be careful. That woman's been through hell. Last thing she needs is more heartache." The warning stayed with Xavier as he rode back to Vivian's cabin. He'd been so focused on defending her against the town's prejudice that he hadn't fully considered how his growing feelings might affect her. The realization that he cared for Vivian as more than a friend had crept up on him gradually, but now it sat squarely in his consciousness, impossible to ignore. When he arrived, he found Vivian in her garden, harvesting the last of the season's vegetables before the first frost. She straightened as he approached, brushing dirt from her hands. "What did the sheriff say?" she asked without preamble. Xavier dismounted, leading his horse to the water trough as he recounted his conversation with Thompson, Parker, and Hamilton. Vivian listened intently, her expression growing more troubled. "So nothing will be done," she concluded when he finished. "Not unless they make a more direct move," Xavier admitted. "But Thompson will keep an eye out, and so will I." Vivian shook her head. "You can't keep riding out here every day, Xavier. You have your own ranch to manage. I'll make time," he insisted. "Why?" The question hung between them, direct and unavoidable. "Why are you doing all this for me?" Xavier hesitated, knowing the honest answer might frighten her away. Because I care what happens to you, he finally said, choosing his words carefully. Is that so hard to believe? Yes, Vivian replied simply. Most people in this town would be happy to see me gone. It would be easier for everyone if they didn't have to look at me and remember what happened. I'm not most people, Xavier reminded her. No, she agreed quietly. You're not. She turned back to her garden, seemingly focused on the task at hand, but Xavier could see the tension in her shoulders. I can't offer you anything, Xavier. Not friendship, not anything else. I'm not the woman I was before Calloway Ridge. That woman died there with everyone else. The raw honesty in her words struck Xavier deeply. He moved closer, stopping just short of touching her. You're right. You're not the same woman. How could you be? But that doesn't mean you're broken beyond repair, Vivian. It means you're changing, adapting, surviving. She looked up at him then, her gray eyes bright with unshed tears. There are things you don't know about me, about what happened that day. Then tell me, he urged gently. Whatever it is, it won't change how I see you. Vivian studied his face for a long moment, as if searching for any sign of insincerity. Finally, she straightened, decision made. Come inside. If you're going to hear this, I need to sit down. Inside the cabin, Vivian moved with deliberate calm, building up the fire and putting water on to boil for tea. Xavier waited patiently, recognizing her need to prepare herself for whatever painful truths she was about to share. When they were finally seated across from each other, steaming cups between them, Vivian began her story. I came to Calloway Ridge 2 years ago to teach at the new school. It was a rough mining camp, but the pay was good, and they desperately needed someone who could educate the children. Her voice was steady, almost detached, as if she were telling someone else's story. I met James there, James Calloway. The camp was named for his family. He owned the largest claim. She paused, taking a careful sip of her tea before continuing. We were to be married this past spring. He was kind, gentle, different from the other miners. He wanted to build something permanent at the ridge, a real town, not just a mining camp. Xavier nodded, keeping his expression neutral, despite the unexpected twist of jealousy he felt at the mention of her fiancé. The trouble started last winter, Vivian continued. A new group arrived at the camp, men who claimed to be independent prospectors, but always seemed to have more money than their fines justified. Their leader was a man named Reeves. From the beginning, he took an interest in me. Her hands tightened around her cup. James confronted him after Reeves cornered me one evening. There was a fight. Reeves left town the next day with his men, and we thought that was the end of it. The growing dread in Xavier's chest told him this was far from the end of the story. But it wasn't, he prompted gently when Vivian fell silent. She shook her head, her gaze fixed on some distant point only she could see. 3 months later, they came back. It was early morning. I was in the schoolhouse preparing for the day when I heard the first shots. Her voice wavered for the first time. By the time I ran outside, half the camp was already. They were... Xavier reached across the table, tentatively covering her hand with his. To his surprise, she didn't pull away. They weren't prospectors, she continued after a moment. They were hired by Territorial Mining Company to drive out the independent miners. I learned that later. That day, all I knew was that Reeves and his men were systematically murdering everyone in camp. How did you survive? Xavier asked softly. Vivian's expression hardened. James found me. He had been shot already, but he managed to get me to the edge of camp. He told me to run, to get help. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I should have stayed with him, should have died with him, but I ran. You did what he asked, Xavier countered gently. You survived to tell the truth. I didn't get far, Vivian continued as if she hadn't heard him. Reeves saw me fleeing. He caught up to me about a mile from camp. He said now that James was dead, I could be his. When I fought back, he shot me and left me for dead in a dry wash. Xavier's hand tightened involuntarily around hers, rage building in him at the thought of what she had endured. But you survived. I crawled 3 miles with a bullet in my shoulder, she said, a hint of grim pride entering her voice. Found a waterhole, somehow stayed alive until a Paiute hunting party found me 2 days later. They took me to their camp, treated my wound. By the time I was strong enough to travel to the nearest town, everyone at Cowboy Ridge had been buried in a mass grave. The official report said it was an Apache raid. And Reeves? Xavier asked, already suspecting the answer. Disappeared, along with his men. Vivian finally met his gaze directly. When I tried to tell the authorities what really happened, no one believed me, said I was traumatized, confused. By the time I recovered enough to return to Promise Creek, the story of the Apache massacre was accepted as fact, and I was just the poor, broken survivor who might be a bit touched in the head. The pieces fell into place for Xavier the town's whispers, Vivian's isolation, and most significantly, the mining company's sudden interest in her land. They're afraid of you, he realized aloud. The mining company. You're the only witness to what they did at Cowboy Ridge. Vivian nodded grimly. And now they want my land. Convenient, isn't it? We need to take this to the federal marshal, Xavier insisted, already formulating a plan. With everything that's happened, they can't ignore— They already have, Vivian interrupted. I wrote to the territorial governor 3 times. No response. I tried to speak with the circuit judge when he came through Promise Creek in June. He patted my hand and told me I should consider moving somewhere peaceful to recover from my ordeal. The frustration and helplessness in her voice stirred something protective in Xavier. Then we'll find another way. The newspaper in Tucson might listen. Or we could— Xavier. Vivian cut him off gently, finally withdrawing her hand from his. I've accepted that justice isn't coming. All I want now is to be left in peace on my father's land. And if the mining company doesn't let that happen, he challenged. Her expression hardened with resolve. Then I'll deal with that when it comes. Xavier wanted to argue further, but recognized the determination in her eyes. Instead, he asked the question that had been haunting him since she began her story. Why tell me all this now? You've kept it to yourself for months. Vivian's gaze softened slightly. Because you deserve to know what you're involving yourself with. And because— She hesitated, vulnerability flashing across her features. Because I needed someone to know the truth, to believe me. I believe every word, Xavier assured her. And I'm not going anywhere, Vivian. Not unless you tell me to. Something shifted in her expression, a cautious warmth that made Xavier's heart beat faster. I don't want you to go, she admitted quietly, and that terrifies me more than Parker and his mining company ever could. The winter of 1878 descended on Promise Creek with unusual ferocity, bringing heavy snowfall that isolated the smaller homesteads for days at a time. Xavier found himself increasingly dividing his time between his ranch and Vivian's cabin, weathering the storms together and developing a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Though Vivian maintained certain boundaries, Xavier always slept in the barn loft when he stayed. Their companionship deepened with each passing week. She began to smile more frequently, even laugh occasionally at Xavier's dry humor. The nightmares that had plagued her seemed less frequent, though Xavier knew from the occasional dark circles under her eyes that they hadn't disappeared entirely. In town, attitudes toward Vivian slowly began to shift as Xavier's staunch defense of her became well known. While some still whispered behind her back when she came for supplies, others, like young Dr. Bennett and his wife, or Mrs. Carruthers, who ran the boarding house, made efforts to treat her with normal courtesy. The mining company representatives had been conspicuously absent since Xavier's confrontation with Parker, though he remained vigilant. Sheriff Thompson reported that they had been focusing their acquisition efforts further north, suggesting they might have temporarily abandoned their interest in Vivian's land. As Christmas approached, Xavier found himself wanting to create something special for Vivian, a normal holiday, to replace the painful memories of the previous year. Without telling her his plans, he arranged for a small pine tree to be cut and delivered to his ranch, along with simple decorations ordered from a catalog. On Christmas Eve, he arrived at Vivian's cabin with the tree tied to his pack horse and saddlebags filled with food, decorations, and carefully wrapped gifts. When Vivian opened her door to find Xavier standing there with a tree, her expression of shock quickly gave way to something more complicated, pleasure mingled with sorrow. "What's all this?" she asked, her voice catching slightly. "Thought we might celebrate properly," Xavier replied, suddenly uncertain whether he'd overstepped. "If that's all right with you." Vivian seemed to struggle with herself for a moment before nodding. "Bring it in." Together, they set up the small tree in the corner of Vivian's cabin. As Xavier unpacked the simple ornaments, wooden stars, paper angels, and strands of cranberries he'd painstakingly strung the night before, he noticed how carefully Vivian handled each item, as if they might shatter at her touch. "I haven't celebrated Christmas since," she began, then stopped herself. "It's been a while." "Me too," Xavier admitted, hanging a carved wooden horse on a branch. "After Sarah and the baby died, holidays just felt empty." Vivian paused in arranging a paper angel. "Tell me about them," she said quietly. "Your wife and son. You never speak of them." Xavier's hands stilled for a moment as memories washed over him, Sarah's gentle laugh, the weight of his infant son in his arms. "Sarah was kind," he finally said, "patient in a way I never managed to be. She loved poetry and could name every wildflower in the territory." He smiled faintly. "Our boy, William, was barely 6 months old when the cholera came. He had Sarah's eyes." Vivian moved closer, her presence somehow both comforting and electrifying. "You must miss them terribly." "Every day," Xavier acknowledged. "But it's different now. The pain doesn't go away, but it changes, becomes part of you rather than consuming you." "Does it?" Vivian asked, and Xavier recognized the question wasn't merely about his experience, but about her own grief. "Eventually," he promised. "Not completely and not all at once, but yes, it does." They finished decorating the tree in contemplative silence. When the last ornament was placed, Xavier lit the small candles secured to the branches while Vivian watched with an expression of wonder that made her look younger, almost carefree. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "There's more," Xavier said, retrieving the packages from his saddlebag. "I know it's not Christmas Day yet, but I thought perhaps we could exchange gifts tonight." Vivian's expression fell. "I don't have anything for you. I didn't think—" "Your company is gift enough," Xavier assured her. "But these are for you." He handed her the first package, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. Vivian unwrapped it slowly to reveal a beautiful leather-bound journal and fountain pen. "I noticed you writing sometimes," Xavier explained. "Thought you might like something nicer than those loose pages you've been using." Vivian traced the embossed cover with gentle fingers. "It's perfect," she murmured. "Thank you." The second gift was smaller, a silver locket on a delicate chain. When Vivian opened it, she found it empty, waiting for mementos of her choosing. "To hold whatever memories you want to keep close," Xavier explained softly. Vivian looked up at him, emotion shining in her eyes. "Help me put it on?" Xavier took the necklace with suddenly unsteady hands. Vivian turned, lifting her auburn hair to expose the nape of her neck. As he fastened the clasp, his fingers brushed against her skin, and he felt her slight shiver at the contact. When she turned back to face him, the locket resting against the hollow of her throat, Xavier was struck by how beautiful she looked in the candlelight, not just physically, but with a luminous strength that took his breath away. "I do have something for you," Vivian said suddenly, moving to the small chest at the foot of her bed. From it, she withdrew a carefully folded bundle. "I've been working on this for weeks. It wasn't meant as a Christmas gift, but—" She handed the package to Xavier, who unwrapped it to find a finely knitted scarf in deep blue wool. "You made this?" he asked, running his fingers over the intricate pattern. Vivian nodded, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "I noticed your old one was wearing thin. It gets cold in that barn loft." The thoughtfulness of the gift and the realization that she had been planning it for some time touched Xavier deeply. It's perfect, he said, echoing her earlier words. Thank you, Vivian. They spent the evening sharing a Christmas Eve meal by candlelight, the small cabin warm with firelight and something else, a tentative hope that neither dared name. As the hour grew late and Xavier prepared to head to the barn for the night, Vivian stopped him at the door. Xavier, she said, her voice soft but steady. Stay, not in the barn, here. The invitation hung between them, its meaning unmistakable. Xavier studied her face carefully, searching for any sign of uncertainty. Are you sure? Vivian took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. I've been alone for so long, not just since Cowboy Ridge, but inside where it matters. I don't want to be alone tonight. Xavier reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. Neither do I. Their first kiss was gentle, hesitant a question rather than a demand. When Vivian responded by stepping closer, deepening the kiss, Xavier felt something long dormant within him flare to life. He held her carefully, aware of the trust she was placing in him, the barriers she was lowering for the first time since tragedy had reshaped her world. That night, they shared more than physical intimacy. They shared the broken pieces of their past and the fragile hope for their future. As Vivian fell asleep in his arms, Xavier made a silent vow to protect this remarkable woman who had survived so much, not because she needed his protection, but because she deserved to never face darkness alone again. The new year brought changes to Promise Creek. Word arrived that the railroad would be extending a spur line to within 10 miles of town, bringing the promise of growth and prosperity. The news accelerated the mining company's activities in the region, with land prices rising rapidly in anticipation of development. For Vivian and Xavier, the weeks following Christmas brought a deepening of their relationship, though not without challenges. Vivian still struggled with nightmares and moments of withdrawal when memories overwhelmed her. Xavier learned to recognize the signs, a distant look in her eyes, a sudden tensing of her body, and give her the space she needed without making her feel abandoned. They settled into a routine that accommodated both their needs. Xavier divided his time between his ranch and Vivian's cabin, gradually bringing more of his belongings to her home until it became clear to both of them that they were building a life together, unplanned but increasingly deliberate. In late January, Xavier formally asked Vivian to marry him while they sat before the fire in her cabin. He had no ring to offer. He would purchase one in Tucson when they could travel together. But the sincerity of his proposal needed no embellishment. I know it hasn't been long, he acknowledged, holding her hands in his. And I know we both carry ghosts with us. But I love you, Vivian Reed. I want to build a future with you, if you'll have me. Vivian's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Are you sure? The town still whispers about me. Being tied to the crazy woman from Cowboy Ridge won't make your life easier. Let them whisper, Xavier replied firmly. I know who you are. That's all that matters to me. The smile that bloomed across Vivian's face was like sunrise after the longest night. Then yes, she said, her voice steady and sure. Yes, I will marry you, Xavier Irwin. Their private joy was interrupted the following day by an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Thompson rode up to Vivian's cabin looking grim, his weathered face etched with concern. Got some news you both need to hear, he said after dismounting. A man was arrested in Santa Fe last week for drunken brawling, started boasting about a mining camp massacre he'd been part of. Name's Miller, says he rode with a man named Reeves. Vivian went perfectly still, her face draining of color. Xavier moved closer to her, his hand settling protectively at the small of her back. Is he talking? Xavier asked. The sheriff nodded grimly. Federal marshal got involved when Miller mentioned Cowboy Ridge. He's offered testimony in exchange for leniency. Named names, including several men connected to territorial mining. Reeves? Vivian asked, her voice barely audible. Still at large, Thompson admitted, but they're looking for him. And more importantly, they're looking into the mining company's involvement. The marshal wants to speak with you, Vivian, says your testimony could be crucial." Xavier felt Vivian tremble slightly beneath his hand, but when she spoke, her voice was steady. "When?" "Marshall's riding circuit. He'll be in Promise Creek in 3 days." Thompson shifted uncomfortably. "There's something else you should know. Elijah Parker left town suddenly yesterday. Cleaned out his accounts at the bank before he went." "He's running," Xavier concluded, "because he knows what's coming." "Seems likely," the sheriff agreed. "I've posted deputies to keep an eye on your property, Miss Reed, just in case anyone else gets nervous about you testifying." After Thompson departed, Vivian sat heavily at her kitchen table, her expression distant. Xavier knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "You don't have to do this if it's too difficult," he said gently. "No one would blame you." Vivian's focus sharpened as she looked at him, determination replacing shock. "I have to do this. For James. For everyone at Calloway Ridge. For myself." She squeezed his hands. "I've been waiting for someone to believe me, Xavier. I can't turn away now that they finally do." The federal marshal, a stern-faced man named Everett, arrived in Promise Creek right on schedule. His interview with Vivian was lengthy and detailed, conducted in Sheriff Thompson's office with Xavier present at her request. She recounted the events at Calloway Ridge with careful precision, answering the marshal's probing questions without faltering. "You've shown remarkable courage, Miss Reed," Marshal Everett said when they had finished. "Your testimony corroborates Miller's account and gives us grounds to pursue charges against the mining company executives." "What happens now?" Xavier asked. "Investigation continues. Grand jury in Tucson, likely within the month." The marshal gathered his notes. "Miss Reed will need to testify again, and I should warn you, both cases like this attract attention. The company has powerful friends who won't take kindly to these accusations." "We understand the risks," Vivian said firmly. "One more thing," the marshal added, reaching into his satchel. "This was recovered among Miller's possessions. He claims it belonged to James Calloway." He placed a small object on the desk, a simple gold band engraved with intertwined vines, Vivian's engagement ring from James. She stared at it for a long moment before slowly picking it up. "Thank you," she whispered. That evening, alone in her cabin, Vivian opened the silver locket Xavier had given her for Christmas. With steady hands, she placed the ring inside before closing it again. "I need to keep this," she explained to Xavier, who watched in silent understanding. "Not because I'm still holding on to James, but because it's part of my past, part of what made me who I am now." Xavier nodded, drawing her into his embrace. "I know. And I love who you are, every piece, every scar." The weeks that followed brought significant changes to Promise Creek. Word of the federal investigation into territorial mining spread quickly, dividing the town between those who had benefited from the company's investments and those who welcomed justice for the Calloway Ridge massacre. Xavier and Vivian became the center of much speculation and, increasingly, open hostility from Parker's former associates. Windows were broken at Vivian's cabin, threatening notes were left on her door. Xavier took to staying with her every night, his rifle close at hand. Despite the tension, they proceeded with plans for their future together. They would marry after the grand jury proceedings, combining their properties into one ranch. Xavier's modest herd would be moved to Vivian's land, which had better water access, while they would maintain his cabin as a line shack for the expanded operation. In early March, just days before they were scheduled to travel to Tucson for the grand jury, disaster struck. Xavier had returned to his ranch to oversee the spring calving when a messenger arrived from Promise Creek with urgent news. Vivian's cabin was on fire. Xavier rode harder than he ever had in his life, covering the distance in half the usual time. As he crested the final ridge, his heart nearly stopped at the sight of smoke billowing into the clear blue sky. The cabin was fully engulfed in flames, with several townspeople forming a bucket brigade from the well to prevent the fire from spreading to the barn and outbuildings. He spotted Sheriff Thompson directing the efforts and rode straight to him. "Where's Vivian?" he demanded, his voice raw with fear. The sheriff's grim expression sent ice through Xavier's veins. "We don't know. She's not here, Xavier, and this was no accident. Lamp oil was poured all around the foundation." The next hours passed in a blur of frantic searching. Xavier led one search party while the sheriff organized others, scouring the surrounding countryside for any sign of Vivian. As darkness fell with no trace of her, Xavier refused to stop, continuing by torchlight until his horse nearly collapsed from exhaustion. It was past midnight when he finally returned to the smoldering ruins of the cabin. Sheriff Thompson was waiting, his expression grave. "Found something," he said, leading Xavier to his horse. From the saddlebag, he withdrew a familiar silver locket, the chain broken. This was on the trail heading south, about 2 miles out. There were signs of a struggle. Xavier took the locket, his fingers tightening around it until the edges bit into his palm. "Reeves," he said, his voice deadly calm. "He's come back for her." "We don't know that for certain," the sheriff cautioned, though his tone suggested he believed it too. "I know," Xavier insisted, "and I know where he's taking her." Understanding dawned in the sheriff's tired eyes. "Cowboy Ridge." "He's twisted enough to think it fitting," Xavier confirmed. "How many men can you gather?" 4, maybe 5 deputies by morning," Thompson replied. "But Xavier, Cowboy Ridge is a 3-day ride. If he's got that much of a head start—" "Then I ride alone," Xavier cut him off. "I know a shorter route through Apache territory. It's dangerous, but it'll cut the journey to 2 days." "You'll never make it through Apache land alone," the sheriff protested. "I have to try," Xavier replied, already turning toward the barn where his exhausted horse was resting. "Send your men the regular route. If I don't find them at the ridge—" He didn't complete the thought. He couldn't imagine a future where he failed to find Vivian alive. After gathering supplies and saddling a fresh horse from Vivian's small corral, Xavier set out under the light of a waning moon. The route he planned to take was one he'd traveled only once before, years earlier, when he'd served briefly as a scout for the cavalry. It cut directly through a mountain pass that the Apache considered sacred ground, rarely patrolled but potentially deadly for any white man caught trespassing. The risk was necessary. Each minute that passed was another minute Vivian remained in the hands of the man who had already tried to kill her once. Xavier wouldn't allow him a second chance. The first day of hard riding brought him to the edge of Apache territory by nightfall. He made a cold camp, not risking a fire that might attract attention, and managed only a few hours of fitful sleep before continuing at first light. The mountain pass loomed before him, a narrow trail winding between towering stone walls that would either provide his shortcut or become his tomb. As he urged his horse forward, Xavier's mind was filled with images of Vivian, her rare smile that transformed her entire face, the determined set of her jaw when she stood her ground, the vulnerability in her eyes when she finally allowed him to see her pain. The thought that he might lose her now, when she had finally begun to heal, was unbearable. Halfway through the pass, Xavier's luck ran out. A small party of Apache warriors appeared as if from the very rocks themselves, surrounding him with rifles and bows drawn. Their leader, a stern-faced man with a cavalry scar across his cheek, addressed him in heavily accented English. "You trespass on sacred ground, white man." Xavier slowly raised his hands. "I seek no trouble with the Apache. A woman has been taken, the survivor from Cowboy Ridge. The man who killed all those people has her." The warrior's expression remained impassive, but Xavier noticed a subtle shift in his posture. The woman with fire hair, who was wounded. Hope flared in Xavier's chest. "Yes. Some of your people found her after the massacre, saved her life." The warriors conferred briefly in their own language before the leader turned back to Xavier. "This woman was helped by our brothers to the north. They speak of her with respect. She did not blame our people for the crimes of white men." "She's in danger now," Xavier pressed. "I have to reach Cowboy Ridge before it's too late." After a long, tense moment, the leader nodded once. We will guide you through our lands. If your words are true, and this evil man returns to the place of great killing, he must be stopped. Such darkness calls more darkness to the land." With the Apache warriors leading the way, Xavier made better time than he had dared hope. They knew hidden trails and water sources that allowed them to travel through the night, resting the horses only when absolutely necessary. By dawn of the third day, they approached the outskirts of what had once been Callaway Ridge. The mining camp was now a ghost town, abandoned buildings slowly reclaimed by the desert, the mass grave marked by a simple wooden cross. From their position on a ridge overlooking the settlement, Xavier could see movement near the mine entrance, two horses tethered outside, one of which he recognized as Vivian's mare. 3 men, his Apache guide noted quietly. 1 guards, 2 inside. Xavier studied the layout, formulating a plan. "I need to get closer. Find out if Vivian is still alive." The Apache leader nodded. "We will create a distraction. When the guard moves to look, you go." The strategy was simple but effective. 1 warrior circled wide to the opposite side of the camp and dislodged a cascade of rocks down the hillside. As the guard predictably moved to investigate, Xavier slipped down the slope and into the shadow of an abandoned cabin near the mine entrance. From his new position, he could hear voices echoing from within the mine shaft, a man's angry tones, and, to his immense relief, Vivian's defiant responses. She was alive. "You should have died here with the others," the male voice snarled. "Would have been poetic. But you had to survive, had to start talking to marshals and stirring up trouble." "You won't get away with this, Reeves," Vivian replied, her voice strained but steady. "People know what you did now. The company can't protect you anymore." A harsh laugh echoed from the mine. "Company's already cutting ties, covering their tracks. Parker and the others are halfway to Mexico by now, but before I join them, I'm going to finish what I started here." Xavier had heard enough. Signaling to the Apache warriors that Vivian was inside with 2 captors, he drew his revolver and moved toward the mine entrance. The guard was still investigating the rock slide, his back to the shaft. The moment Xavier stepped into the mine tunnel, the familiar smell of damp earth and minerals enveloped him. He moved carefully, following the voices deeper into the mountain. A lantern's glow illuminated a chamber ahead, once an active dig site, now the stage for Reeves's twisted revenge. Xavier paused at the edge of the light, taking in the scene. Vivian sat against the rock wall, her hands bound before her, a bruise darkening her left cheek. Despite her situation, her posture remained proud, defiant. Reeves paced before her, a pistol in his hand, while another man, presumably Miller's replacement, stood nearby with a rifle. Xavier took careful aim at the armed henchman first. His shot echoed deafeningly in the confined space, dropping the man before he could react. Reeves spun toward the tunnel, firing wildly as Xavier ducked behind a support beam. "Who's there?" Reeves shouted, his voice edged with panic. "Show yourself!" "Xavier!" Vivian cried, hope and fear mingling in her voice. Reeves turned back to her, pressing his gun against her temple. "Your cowboy came to die with you. How touching! Come out now, or I put a bullet in her head." Xavier's mind raced, calculating angles and risks. "Let her go, Reeves. It's over. The marshal knows everything." "Then I've got nothing to lose, do I?" Reeves replied, cocking his pistol. At that moment, the mine timbers began to rattle a low rumbling that quickly intensified. Years of abandonment had weakened the supports, and the gunfire had disturbed the delicate balance. The earth itself seemed to be passing judgment. As dust and small rocks showered down, Xavier saw his opportunity. He lunged from his position, tackling Reeves just as a larger section of ceiling collapsed behind them. They struggled for the gun, rolling across the chamber floor, while Vivian worked desperately to free herself from her bonds. Reeves was strong, driven by desperation and hate, but Xavier fought with the focused determination of a man who had found something worth living for and would die before losing it. When his fingers finally closed around Reeves's wrist, forcing the gun upward, the sudden crack of a shot surprised them both. Reeves went still, his eyes wide with shock as blood bloomed across his chest, not from Xavier's hand, but from Vivian's. She stood trembling, the dead henchman's rifle in her hands, as dust and debris continued to rain down around them. "We need to get out," she said, her voice eerily calm. "The whole mine is coming down." Xavier didn't waste time checking if Reeves was dead. He grabbed Vivian's hand, and together they ran for the entrance, dodging falling rocks and splintering timbers. They emerged into blinding sunlight, just as the mine entrance collapsed behind them in a cloud of dust and a roar of shifting earth. The guard had fled, apparently spooked by the Apache warriors who now emerged from their positions around the abandoned camp. Xavier held Vivian tightly, his heart pounding with adrenaline and profound relief. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered into her hair, not caring who witnessed his vulnerability. Vivian clung to him with equal fervor. "I knew you'd come," she replied. "I never doubted it." The Apache leader approached them, his expression solemn. "The mountain has buried the evil. It is finished." Vivian turned to the warriors, her posture straightening despite her exhaustion and injuries. "Thank you for helping him find me," she said with quiet dignity. "I owe you my life twice over now." The leader inclined his head in acknowledgement. "The balance is restored. We will guide you safely from our lands." True to their word, the Apache warriors escorted Xavier and Vivian back through the mountain pass, parting ways at the border of their territory with a silent salute that acknowledged the bond forged through shared danger and respect. As they rode toward Promise Creek, Vivian recounted her ordeal, how Reeves and his men had ambushed her at the cabin, setting the fire to cover their tracks and attempting to stage her disappearance as a flight to avoid testifying. Their plan had been to kill her at Cowboy Ridge and make it appear she had taken her own life out of guilt or madness. "He underestimated you," Xavier observed. Again. Vivian's smile was weary but genuine. "He saw only what he wanted to see, a broken woman, not who I really am." "And who are you, Vivian Reed?" Xavier asked softly, riding close beside her. She considered the question seriously before answering. "I'm a survivor, a teacher, a woman who lost everything but found the strength to build something new." She reached across to take his hand. "And I'm someone who has learned that being broken doesn't mean being defeated." 2 months later, on a perfect May morning, Vivian Reed became Vivian Irwin in a simple ceremony in Promise Creek's small church. The pews were filled with townspeople who had gradually come to see Vivian not as the tragic ghost of Cowboy Ridge, but as the resilient woman who had helped bring justice to the victims of the massacre. The federal investigation had resulted in indictments against 3 executives of the Territorial Mining Company, with more arrests expected as the case expanded. Elijah Parker had indeed fled to Mexico, but was captured attempting to cross into Guatemala. The story had made newspapers as far east as Chicago, bringing unwelcome scrutiny to the mining practices throughout the territory. After the ceremony, as friends and neighbors gathered at the newly rebuilt cabin on Vivian's land, now the heart of the combined Irwin Ranch, Sheriff Thompson raised a toast to the bride and groom. "To Xavier and Vivian," he proclaimed, "2 people who reminded us all what real strength looks like." Later, as the celebration continued around them, Xavier found a moment alone with his bride near the garden she had replanted with such care. "Happy?" he asked, though her radiant smile had already answered the question. "More than I thought possible," Vivian replied, leaning into his embrace. "A year ago, I couldn't imagine feeling anything but pain ever again." Xavier kissed her forehead gently. "And now? Now I know that healing doesn't mean forgetting the past," she said thoughtfully. "It means building a future that honors it." Her hand moved unconsciously to the silver locket she still wore, now repaired and containing both James's ring and a small photograph of Xavier. "I'll always carry what happened at Cowboy Ridge with me, but it doesn't define me anymore." "No," Xavier agreed, gazing at the extraordinary woman he had the privilege of calling his wife. What defines you is the strength it took to survive it, and the courage to love again afterward." Vivian smiled up at him, her gray eyes clear and bright with promise. "The townspeople used to whisper that I was too broken to ever be whole again. And I told them you were the strongest woman I know," Xavier reminded her. "I was right then, and I'm even more certain of it now." As the sun set over their land, the place where they would build their life together, perhaps raise children someday, Vivian and Xavier Irwin stood united, two souls who had each weathered their own storms and emerged stronger for having found each other in the aftermath. The whispers in Promise Creek had finally changed. Now, when people spoke of Vivian Reed Irwin, they told a different story, one of a woman who had faced unimaginable tragedy and emerged not broken, but unbreakably resilient. And beside her stood the man who had seen her strength when others saw only her scars, the cowboy who had recognized that surviving didn't make her damaged, it made her extraordinary.